I am your host, Miss Marple. Let's begin our journey.
The St. Mary Mead annual chrysanthemum show was, for many, the pinnacle of the social calendar, a day where the quiet competition of the flowerbeds finally broke ground into public triumph or bitter defeat. This year, the late September sun was particularly mellow, bathing the white canvas tents in a warm, buttery light. The scent of damp earth and prize-winning blooms hung heavy in the air, mingled with the faint, sharp tang of Mrs. Price Ridley's famous elderberry wine. Miss Marple, wearing a sensible hat of lavender felt and clutching a small beaded handbag, moved through the aisles with a delicate grace that belied her 80-odd years. To the casual observer, Jane Marple was merely a sweet, perhaps slightly vague, elderly lady admiring the bronze giants. In reality, her pale blue eyes were taking in far more than petals and stems. She noted the way Colonel Melchert's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his display, and the sharp, almost predatory gaze with which Lady Tressilian surveyed the competition. Miss Marple had always found that people were never so much themselves as when they were trying to prove their worth in a garden. The afternoon's tranquillity was shattered at precisely 4 o'clock, the time designated for the announcement of the best in show. The committee, led by the perpetually flustered Mr. Henderson, gathered on the small wooden dais. There was a conspicuous gap in the front row where Arthur Murchison, the village's most celebrated and most cantankerous gardener, should have been standing. Murchison was a man who lived for this moment. He had won the trophy for 5 consecutive years and was widely expected to make it a 6th with his legendary Crimson Sovereign chrysanthemum. "Has anyone seen Arthur?" Mr. Henderson whispered, his voice carrying further than intended through the silence of the tent. "He hasn't been to his stall since the judging began at midday." A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. Arthur Murchison was not a man for mysteries or absences. He was as reliable as the seasons and twice as stubborn. When a search of the refreshment tent and the nearby bowling green yielded nothing, the concern turned into a palpable dread. It was young Peter, the boy who helped in the Murchison greenhouses, who finally brought the day to a chilling halt. He came running from the direction of the old quarry woods, his face the colour of wood ash. "The shed!" he gasped, pointing toward the edge of the showgrounds where the prize-winning entries were prepared. "Mr. Murchison's shed, the doors swinging wide, and his favourite pruning shears are driven right into the workbench, but there's no sign of him. And his Crimson Sovereign, it's been shredded, every single petal just torn to bits." The silence that followed was absolute. In St. Mary Mead, a man's disappearance was shocking, but the systematic destruction of a prize-winning bloom felt like a personal declaration of war. Miss Marple, standing quietly by the dahlias, didn't join the rush toward the woods. Instead, she noticed something that everyone else had overlooked: a small discarded envelope lying near the empty space where the Crimson Sovereign should have stood, addressed in a frantic, slanted hand that did not belong to a gardener. The peaceful afternoon had ended, and as the shadows of the oaks lengthened over the meadow, Miss Marple knew that the village was about to reveal a side of itself that was far from horticultural. The gardener had vanished, but the seeds of a very dark secret had just been sown. By the following morning, the disappearance of Arthur Murchison had effectively replaced the weather as the primary topic of conversation in St. Mary Mead. In the cramped, aromatic interior of the village post office, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of floor wax and sensationalism. Mrs. Higgins, whose capacity for gathering news was rivaled only by her ability to distribute it, was already deep into her 3rd retelling of the events to a captivated audience. "It's the sheer violence of it that gets me," Mrs. Higgins said, leaning over the counter until her pearls rattled against the wood. "To shred those flowers, those beautiful prize-winning flowers. It wasn't just a kidnapping, it was a desecration. And mark my words, it's that nephew of his, that young scamp Julian. He's been seen hanging about the Red Lion at all hours, looking for all the world like a man who needs a large sum of money very quickly. Arthur wouldn't give him a penny, everyone knows that. I shouldn't be surprised if the boy did something desperate. Across the shop, Miss Marple was ostensibly occupied with choosing a birthday card for her niece. She lingered near a display of local postcards, her head tilted slightly as if struggling with the sentiment of a particular verse. In truth, she was cataloguing the reactions. Suspicion, she observed, was a many-coloured thing. For Mrs. Higgins it was a tool for social excitement, for others it was a shield. Mr. Henderson, the show organizer, entered the shop looking as though he hadn't slept a wink. His collar was slightly askew, and he kept twitching his spectacles. "A dreadful business," he muttered to no one in particular. "The police have been at the greenhouses all night. They've found footprints apparently, but they won't say whose, and now there's talk of the old quarry pond being dragged. It's a disgrace to society. Footprints are all well and good," piped up Miss Weatherby, a thin, bird-like woman who lived for the moral failings of her neighbours. But what about the motive? Arthur Murchison was a hard man. He had a tongue that could peel paint off a barn door. He's offended half the village at one time or another. Only last week I saw him having a most unchristian row with Lady Tressilian's head gardener. They were practically at blows over a bag of bone meal. If you ask me, it's a professional grudge that's gone too far. Miss Marple moved toward the counter, her choice made. "A professional grudge," she murmured softly, as if thinking aloud. "Yes, like poor Mr. Bellingham and his prize marrow. Do you remember, Miss Weatherby? Someone poured paraffin over it the night before the judging. It wasn't that they wanted the marrow for themselves, they simply couldn't bear for him to have the glory. Human envy is a very sharp thorn indeed." As she stepped out of the shop and into the crisp morning air, Miss Marple found herself walking toward the Blue Boar, where she knew the local constabulary would be taking their mid-morning tea. The village was already beginning to divide into camps. There were those who favoured the degenerate relative theory involving the nephew Julian, and those who leaned toward the vengeful rival theory, pointing fingers at anyone who had ever lost a rosette to Murchison's chrysanthemums. But there was a third group, much smaller and quieter, who spoke of Murchison's personal life. It was rumoured that the old gardener had recently come into a small inheritance from a distant cousin, a fact he had kept uncharacteristically quiet. Money, Miss Marple knew, changed the chemistry of a situation as surely as lime changed the acidity of the soil. She encountered the vicar's wife, Griselda, near the lich gate of the church. Griselda looked troubled, her usual spark of humour replaced by a weary frown. "It's all so sordid, Jane. The police have been questioning everyone. They even asked the vicar where he was between 2 and 4 yesterday afternoon. Apparently, being at the vestry isn't a good enough alibi these days. And have you heard? They found a woman's glove near the potting shed, a very expensive kid-leather glove, certainly not the sort of thing a gardener's nephew would be wearing." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. "A kid-leather glove. How very peculiar. It reminds me of the time the Duchess of Berkshire lost her emerald brooch. It was found in the pigsty of all places. Everyone thought the pigs had developed a taste for jewellery, but it turned out the scullery maid had a very particular way of hiding her thefts." "You don't think a woman is involved, do you, Jane?" Griselda asked, eyes widening. "Women are always involved in some capacity, dear," Miss Marple replied gently, "whether as the hand that strikes or the heart that provides the reason. But tell me, who in our little village wears kid-leather gloves of such quality?" Griselda thought for a moment. "Well, Lady Tressilian, of course, and perhaps Mrs. Bantry, though she's far too sensible for such things. And then there's that new woman, the one who moved into the old mill house, Mrs. Cavendish. She's always very dressed up, even for a walk to the butcher's." Miss Marple thanked her and continued her stroll, her mind sorting through the names. Lady Tressilian, whose pride was legendary, Mrs. Cavendish, a stranger with unknown antecedents, and the absent Arthur Murchison, who had managed to disappear from the centre of his own triumph. The village was reacting exactly as she expected, with gossip, fear, and a desperate need to find a scapegoat. But the truth, she suspected, was like a bulb planted in winter. It was currently hidden deep beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to push its way into the light. and when it did, it would likely be far more poisonous than anyone in St. Mary Mead dared to imagine. The morning mist was still clinging to the low-lying meadows when Miss Marple decided that her herbaceous border was in dire need of a specific type of organic mulch, a perfectly legitimate reason to visit the Murchison nurseries, which lay just beyond the village boundary. While Inspector Slack and his men were busy stomping through the damp woods with whistles and heavy boots, Miss Marple approached the problem from a more lateral direction. She believed quite firmly that to understand a man's disappearance, one must first understand the life he left behind, much like one might study the empty shell of a snail to understand the creature that once inhabited it. The nurseries were eerily quiet. The long rows of glass houses caught the early light, looking like frozen waves of silver. Miss Marple bypassed the main entrance, where a weary-looking constable was stationed, and slipped through a small gap in the private hedge that she knew was used by the local cats and occasionally the local poachers. She found herself in the working area of the nursery, a place of cracked pots, rusted wheelbarrows, and the sharp acidic scent of fertilizer. She stood still for a long moment, simply listening. In her years at St. Mary Mead, she had learned that silence often spoke louder than words. She watched a robin perch on the edge of a water butt, chirping indignantly at the disruption of its morning routine. Then she began to walk, her eyes scanning the ground with the precision of a hawk. She noticed that the path leading to the potting shed, the scene of the struggle, had been swept recently, not by the police who were far too concerned with clues to worry about dust, but by someone who possessed a gardener's instinctive need for order. Near the edge of the stone flagging, she spotted a small, dark stain. It wasn't blood, it was oil, a very specific type of heavy machine oil, the kind used for high-end motor cars rather than simple lawnmowers. Most singular, she whispered to the robin. Arthur Murchison hated motor cars. He called them stinkpots and refused to let even the delivery vans come past the main gate. She moved toward the potting shed, keeping a respectful distance from the police tape. Through the window, she could see inside. It was exactly as described, the heavy pruning shears driven into the wood with a violence that suggested a sudden, explosive rage. But Miss Marple wasn't looking at the shears. She was looking at the shelf above the workbench. On it sat a small, chipped saucer containing a few crusts of bread and a smear of jam. Arthur Murchison was a man of legendary frugality and precise habits. He took his tea at exactly 4:30 in his cottage, never in the shed. And he detested jam. He was a man of marmalade, and only the bitter, thick-cut variety. The presence of strawberry jam suggested a visitor, someone who'd been made to feel comfortable enough to eat, or perhaps someone who had brought their own snack while waiting for him. As she turned to leave, she encountered the nephew, Julian Murchison. He was a tall, rangy young man with a restless expression and hands that seemed perpetually in search of a cigarette. He looked startled to see her, his eyes darting toward the hedge. "Oh, hello, Miss Marple," he said, his voice a nervous baritone. "Looking for some pansies, are you? I'm afraid the business is closed until the police finish their, whatever it is they're doing." "Good morning, Julian," she replied with a gentle smile. "I was actually looking for your uncle. It's so very unlike him to miss the prize-giving. He was always so punctual. Like poor Mr. Gregson, the clockmaker, you could set your watch by his movements until the day he decided to run away to sea, though I don't suppose Arthur has gone to sea." Julian gave a short, bitter laugh. "The only water my uncle liked was the kind that came out of a watering can. He's probably just wandered off. He was getting old, you know, a bit touched in the head lately. Always talking about protecting his legacy and secrets in the soil." "Secrets in the soil," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. A very poetic phrase for a man who preferred plain speaking. "And did he say what these secrets were, Julian? Or who he was protecting them from?" Julian shrugged, but Miss Marple noticed his fingers twitching against his trouser leg. Just an old man talking. He was paranoid, thought people were trying to steal his techniques. "Look, I have to go back. The police want to go through his ledgers." Miss Marple watched him go to the cottage. He didn't walk like a grieving man, nor did he walk like a guilty one. He walked like a man who was profoundly relieved. It was a subtle distinction, but one she noted with care. As she made her way back to the village, she bypassed Old Mill House. Mrs. Cavendish was in her garden, or rather, she was standing in it, looking at a rosebush as if it were a complex piece of machinery she didn't know how to operate. She was wearing a pair of heavy gardening gloves, but as she raised a hand to wave, Miss Marple saw the flash of a pale wrist. "Lovely morning, Mrs. Cavendish," Miss Marple called out. "Is it?" the woman replied, her voice cool and cultured. "It seems rather dismal to me, what with all this talk of disappearances. One expects peace in the country, not melodrama." Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in the woman's voice. It wasn't fear of a murderer. It was the tension of someone who was holding a very large secret behind a very small gate. She also noted that Mrs. Cavendish's car, a sleek, dark Daimler, was parked in the drive. It was immaculately clean, except for a small, fresh splash of mud on the rear wheel arch. Mud that had the distinct, dark, peaty quality of the soil found only in the Murchison nurseries. The patterns were beginning to emerge like the first faint lines of a sketch. The jam, the oil, the mud, and the secrets in the soil. The police were looking for a body, but Miss Marple was looking for a motive that began long before the chrysanthemum show had even been imagined. The following afternoon, the inevitable happened. Inspector Slack, fueled by a mixture of public pressure and his own desire for a swift resolution, officially detained Julian Murchison for questioning. The news travelled through St. Mary Mead faster than a summer gale. By the time the afternoon tea trays were being laid out, it was common knowledge that the police had found a blood-stained handkerchief in the pockets of Julian's tweed jacket, a jacket he had conveniently misplaced near the potting shed on the day of the disappearance. Miss Marple sat in her small, sun-drenched parlour, her knitting needles clicking a rhythmic accompaniment to her thoughts. She was working on a pair of woolen mittens for the church mission, but her mind was elsewhere. Across from her sat Griselda Clement, who was providing the latest bulletin from the front lines of village gossip. "Slack is absolutely convinced, Jane," Griselda said, leaning forward with a worried frown. "He says the motive is as clear as day. Julian was in debt to some very unsavoury characters in London, and Arthur had recently threatened to cut him out of his will entirely. The theory is that they had a row in the shed, Julian lost his temper, and then, well, the rest is too grim to contemplate. They haven't found a body yet, but Slack says the shredded flowers were a sign of Julian's unbalanced and resentful state of mind." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her gaze fixed on a dropped stitch. "Inspector Slack is a very energetic man, Griselda, energetic and remarkably consistent. He always finds exactly what he is looking for. But it has been my experience that when a man is truly in a state of unbalanced rage, he doesn't usually stop to carefully shred every single petal of a chrysanthemum. He might smash a pot or kick a door. But that sort of systematic destruction, that speaks of a very different kind of emotion. It speaks of a deep, calculated hatred, or perhaps a desire to destroy the very thing someone else loved most." "But what about the handkerchief?" Griselda asked. "And the debts?" "Oh, I don't doubt the debts," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Julian is a very foolish young man. He reminds me of young Harry Thompson, who worked in Draper's. Harry was always borrowing from the till to bet on the horses. He was a thief, certainly, but he was a very timid one. He would never have had the stomach for violence. He would have fainted at the sight of a scraped knee, let alone anything worse. No, I think Julian is the sort of person who is designed by nature to be a very convenient suspect." Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked out the window at her own peaceful garden. The police are looking at the obvious, which is often a very good place to start, but a very dangerous place to stop. They see a rebellious nephew and a grumpy uncle. I see a man like Arthur Murchison who, for all his grumpiness, was a genius with plants. And geniuses, Griselda, often attract the attention of people who are far more sophisticated than a village gardener's nephew. Later that day, Miss Marple made it a point to take her afternoon walk past Lady Tressilian's estate, Gull's Point. The gates were impressive, but the gardens beyond were even more so. As she paused to admire a row of late-blooming lilies, she saw Lady Tressilian herself sitting on the terrace, draped in expensive furs despite the mild weather. Beside her stood Mrs. Cavendish, the newcomer from the old mill house. The two women were engaged in a conversation that looked remarkably intense for a casual visit. As Miss Marple approached the stone balustrade, she caught a fragment of Lady Tressilian's sharp, authoritative voice. "It must be handled with discretion, Myra. If the papers get wind of the connection, the entire legacy is at risk." Mrs. Cavendish's reply was lower, but she looked pale and agitated. She noticed Miss Marple and immediately placed a hand on Lady Tressilian's arm, a silent warning. The conversation ceased abruptly, replaced by the polite, hollow smiles that the upper classes use as armour. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," Lady Tressilian shouted, her voice cracking like dry glass. "Admiring the gardens, a pity about poor Murchison. I suppose the police have finalised their case against that wretched nephew of his?" "Good afternoon, Lady Tressilian," Miss Marple replied with a humble nod. "It is a tragedy indeed, though I was just saying to the vicar's wife that Julian Murchison always seemed such a clumsy boy. It's hard to imagine him doing anything with such precision. And the crimson sovereign was such a beautiful flower. To destroy it seems almost a crime against nature itself." Mrs. Cavendish stepped forward, her silk dress rustling. "Perhaps it wasn't destroyed out of malice, Miss Marple. Perhaps it was destroyed because it represented a truth someone couldn't bear to see recognized." Lady Tressilian gave a sharp, warning cough. Mrs. Cavendish bit her lip and turned away, pretending to examine a nearby urn. Miss Marple continued her walk, her mind buzzing. A truth someone couldn't bear to see recognized. It was a remarkably specific thing to say. She thought back to the oil stain on the path at the nursery and the mud on the Daimler's wheels. She also thought of the secrets in the soil Julian had mentioned. Police were satisfied with the obvious, a family quarrel fueled by greed. But Miss Marple was looking at the high society connection, the discretion Lady Tressilian demanded, and the haunted look in Mrs. Cavendish's eyes. Arthur Murchison hadn't just been a gardener, he had been a keeper of legacies, and legacies, she knew, were often built on foundations that were far more fragile than they appeared. The obvious suspect was in a cell, but the true architect of the gardener's disappearance was still walking free, perhaps even sipping tea on a sunlit terrace. The following morning, the village of St. Mary Mead was enveloped in a thick autumn fog that muffled the sound of the church bells and turned the familiar lanes into a labyrinth of grey shadows. Miss Marple, however, was undeterred by the dampness. She had spent the previous evening reflecting on the peculiar nature of the crimson sovereign chrysanthemum. It was more than just a flower. It was a biological triumph, a secret hybrid that Arthur Murchison had guarded with a ferocity bordering on the fanatical. She decided that a second, more thorough examination of the Murchison cottage was necessary, not the potting shed where the violence had occurred, but the domestic space where the man had lived his private life. She knew that Inspector Slack had already searched the premises, which usually meant he had overturned the mattresses and looked for hidden stashes of money. Slack was looking for what a man might hide. Miss Marple was looking for what a man might inadvertently keep. As she reached the cottage, she found the front door locked and guarded by the same young constable, who was now looking quite miserable in the cold. With a gentle, disarming smile, Miss Marple explained that she had promised Arthur a very specific recipe for a sulphur-based wash for his roses, and she feared that if left in her handbag, the instructions might become illegible. The constable, perhaps bored, or perhaps simply unable to resist the polite persistence of a lady who reminded him of his grandmother, allowed her to step into the porch out of the mist. The porch was cluttered with muddy boots and stacks of old gardening journals. It was here, hidden behind a pair of oversized galoshes, that Miss Marple spotted it, a small discarded seed packet. It was empty, but it wasn't the packet itself that caught her eye. It was the stamp on the back. It was not from any local nursery, nor from the prestigious London houses. It was from an experimental botanical station in the south of France, and it was dated only 3 weeks prior. A gardener like Arthur, she mused, her voice a mere whisper, would never buy seeds from abroad so close to the show. He was a man of his soil, unless, of course, he wasn't buying seeds at all, unless he was verifying something. She moved her gaze to the floor. Near the doorframe, wedged into a crack in the linoleum, was a tiny, shimmering object. She bent down, her fingers nimble despite the chill, and retrieved a small, jagged fragment of glass. It wasn't from a window pane, nor was it from a common drinking glass. It had a distinct curvature and a slight blue tint, the unmistakable characteristics of a high-powered laboratory slide or a specific type of photographic lens. Now, why would a simple gardener have a broken slide in his porch, she wondered. It reminded her of old Mr. Bentley, who used to collect rare butterflies. He had been the gentlest soul until he discovered that his neighbor was poaching the very species he was trying to preserve. The resulting feud had nearly burned down the local library. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a sleek, dark car, the Daimler she had seen at the old mill house. Mrs. Cavendish stepped out, looking more composed than she had on Lady Tressilian's terrace, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the cottage with an intensity that bordered on desperation. When she saw Miss Marple, her expression shifted into one of guarded curiosity. "Still following the breadcrumbs, Miss Marple?" she asked, her voice light but edged with steel. "The police seem quite satisfied that the matter is settled. Julian Murchison is the obvious answer, is he not? A simple case of a nephew's greed. The obvious answer is often like a well-worn path, Mrs. Cavendish," Miss Marple replied, carefully tucking the fragment of glass into her glove. "It is easy to follow, but it rarely leads to the heart of the woods. I was just admiring Arthur's collection of journals. He was such a meticulous man. He kept records of everything, the weather, the soil acidity, even the exact date the first frost touched his petals." Mrs. Cavendish's gaze flickered toward the journals. "Meticulousness can be a burden. Sometimes people record things they don't fully understand, things that are better left unsaid." "Or unproven," Miss Marple added softly, "like the parentage of a flower, or perhaps the parentage of a legacy." The reaction was instantaneous. Mrs. Cavendish's hand tightened on her handbag, the knuckles turning white. For a brief second the mask of the refined newcomer slipped, revealing a flash of genuine cold-blooded fear. Then, with a curt nod and a mumbled excuse about an appointment with her solicitor, she retreated to her car and drove away, the wheels churning up the dark, peaty mud of the driveway. Miss Marple watched the car disappear into the fog. She knew now that the hidden clue wasn't the blood on the handkerchief or the debts Julian owed. It was a glass shard and a seed packet from France. Arthur Murchison hadn't just been growing chrysanthemums, he had been conducting an investigation of his own. He had used his botanical expertise to prove a fraud, not a fraud of the garden, but a fraud of the bloodline. The Crimson Sovereign wasn't just a prize-winning bloom, it was a biological map, and Arthur, in his cantankerous honesty, had planned to use the chrysanthemum show as a stage to expose a secret that Lady Tressilian and Mrs. Cavendish had spent decades, and perhaps a small fortune, trying to bury. The police were looking for a body in the quarry, but Miss Marple was looking for a laboratory. She was looking for the place where a gardener's curiosity had collided with a socialite's survival. And she knew that in St. Mary Mead, just as in any garden, the most poisonous weeds are often the ones that look the most like the prize-winning flowers. The fog that had settled over St. Mary Mead did not lift by the evening. Instead, it became thicker, turning the village into a series of isolated islands of yellow light. Miss Marple, however, found herself sitting in the unusually draughty drawing-room of the old mill house. Mrs. Cavendish had invited her for tea, an invitation that felt less like a gesture of hospitality and more like a tactical maneuver to discover exactly how much the elderly woman knew. The room was decorated with an aggressive sort of modern elegance that felt entirely out of place in a converted mill, much like Mrs. Cavendish herself felt out of place among the village's established families. "It must be so difficult for you, Jane," Mrs. Cavendish began, her voice smooth as cream as she poured from a silver teapot. "To see your quiet little village thrust into such a tawdry spotlight. First a disappearance, and now the police treating every respectable home as a potential crime scene. Lady Tressilian is quite beside herself. She feels these are compromising the county's dignity, suburban dramas." Miss Marple took a delicate sip of her tea, her eyes wandering to a collection of framed photographs on the mantelpiece. "Dignity is very fragile, Myra. It reminds me of poor Mrs. Abernathy. She spent 40 years pretending her husband was a retired colonel, only for it to be discovered upon his death that he had actually been a very successful, but quite illegitimate, manufacturer of corset stays. The shock wasn't the stays, you see, it was the fact that the entire foundation of her social standing was built on a fiction." Mrs. Cavendish's hand paused over the sugar tongs. "A charming anecdote, but I fail to see how it relates to our current troubles. Arthur Murchison was a gardener, not a colonel." "Oh, but he was a man of the soil," Miss Marple replied gently. "And the soil, as you know, never lies. It carries the history of everything planted within it. I was thinking of that seed packet I saw earlier, the one from the botanical station in France. It's a fascinating place, specialized in genetic mapping and the tracing of rare hybrids. It's the sort of place one consults when one needs to prove that a certain strain of life, be it a flower or a family, is truly what it claims to be." The silence that followed was so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. Mrs. Cavendish set the teapot down with a sharp clink. The mask of the gracious hostess was beginning to crack, revealing a desperate, calculating intellect beneath. "You are a very observant woman, Miss Marple, perhaps too observant for your own safety. St. Mary Mead is full of old women with nothing to do but weave fantasies out of the shadows." "Shadows are only cast when there is a light, dear," Miss Marple countered, her voice remaining soft. "And Arthur Murchison was a very bright light when it came to botany. He knew Lady Tressilian's late husband, Sir Richard, had a passion for rare flora. He also knew that Sir Richard spent much time in southern France 30 years ago. It's a small world, isn't it? Especially when a gardener begins to notice that the new mistress of the old mill house has a profile that is strikingly similar to a certain portrait hanging in Gull's Point, a portrait of a woman who was supposedly never born." Mrs. Cavendish stood up, her silk skirts rustling like a nest of vipers. "You are playing a dangerous game. Lady Tressilian is a woman of immense power. If you suggest for one moment that there is some irregularity in the Tressilian succession, or that I am anything other than a distant cousin from the Canadian branch, you will find this village very inhospitable indeed." "I am not suggesting anything, Myra," Miss Marple said, rising with a grace that matched the younger woman's. "I am merely reflecting on human nature. When a great fortune is at stake, people will go to extraordinary lengths to ensure the right person inherits. But Arthur found a secret in the Crimson Sovereign. He didn't just breed it, he used it as a biological marker. He realized that the specific hybrid Sir Richard had been working on in France carried a genetic trait that only someone of his direct bloodline could recognize or recreate. When you arrived and showed such interest in that specific flower, Arthur saw the truth. You aren't a distant cousin, are you? You are the secret daughter Sir Richard left behind, and you've come to claim what Lady Tressilian believes is hers alone." Mrs. Cavendish's face was now a mask of pure icy rage. Arthur was a meddling fool. He thought he could use his little flowers to pull down a dynasty. He threatened to reveal the documentation he'd gathered from France at the chrysanthemum show. He wanted to see Lady Tressilian humiliated in front of the entire county, and so he had to go, Miss Marple murmured, and the flowers had to be destroyed, because they were the physical proof of the connection. It wasn't Julian's rage that shredded those petals, it was your necessity. Miss Cavendish paced toward her, her eyes narrowing. "You have no proof. No body, no documents, and certainly no witnesses. Julian is the one with the motive and the blood-stained handkerchief. The village will believe what the police tell them. The village will believe what the truth compels them to believe," Miss Marple said, moving toward the door. "Good night, Myra. I do hope you sleep well. I've always found that the sound of the mill wheel can be quite haunting at night. It sounds a bit like a man's voice calling out from the dark." As Miss Marple stepped back into the fog, she felt the weight of the secret she had just uncovered. The vanishing gardener was no longer a mystery of the woods, it was a battle for a kingdom. But she knew that Mrs. Cavendish had made a fatal error. In her haste to silence Arthur, she had forgotten that a gardener's work doesn't end when he leaves the garden. Seeds have a way of clinging to the most unexpected places. The fog that had smothered St. Mary Mead for 48 hours finally began to pull back, retreating into the hollows of the quarry and leaving behind a landscape that felt scrubbed raw. This clarity, however, brought a fresh wave of alarm. While Inspector Slack was busy orchestrating a second search of the Murchison greenhouses, convinced that Julian had buried his uncle beneath a layer of prize-winning compost, a discovery was made at the old mill that shifted the center of gravity entirely. A group of local boys, daring each other to explore the swollen banks of the mill stream, found a heavy, oil-stained tarpaulin snagged against the rusted ironwork of the sluice gate. When the local constable hauled it onto the bank, he didn't find the body of Arthur Murchison. Instead, he found a collection of heavy, professional-grade laboratory equipment, a microscope with a shattered lens, several broken glass slides, and a metal box containing a series of meticulously kept botanical ledgers. The ledgers were soaked, but the name on the inside cover was unmistakable: Arthur Murchison. The twist sent the village into a new frenzy of speculation. If Julian had killed his uncle for money, why would he steal and then discard scientific equipment? And why at the old mill, a property owned by the refined Mrs. Cavendish? Miss Marple received the news while she was in her garden, tidying the stems of her Michaelmas daisies. It was Griselda who brought the bulletin, her breath misting in the cool air. "Jane, it's extraordinary. They haven't found Arthur, but they found his secrets. Slack is furious. He's had to release Julian on bail because the boy doesn't even know how to use a microscope, let alone own one. But the real shock is the blood. There was a great deal of it on that tarpaulin, and Dr. Haydock says it's definitely human." Miss Marple paused, her pruning shears poised. Human blood on a tarpaulin at the mill. And the equipment was broken, you say? How very violent. It reminds me of the time the old schoolmaster, Mr. Finch, fell out with the chemist. Mr. Finch was convinced the chemist was overcharging the parish for cough syrup, and he spent months secretly weighing the bottles. He thought he was being a detective, you see, but he was actually just making himself a very dangerous nuisance. "You think Arthur was being a nuisance?" Griselda asked. "I think Arthur was being a scientist," Miss Marple replied, her eyes sharpening. "And a scientist with proof is far more dangerous to a liar than a nephew with a grudge. But tell me, dear, was there anything else in the box? Anything organic?" Griselda frowned, thinking back. The constable mentioned some dried plant material, shredded bits of red flower. It looked like the remains of the Crimson Sovereign. "Slack thinks the killer tried to drown the evidence." Miss Marple nodded slowly. The pieces were moving into a formation she recognized, but there was still a jagged edge that didn't fit. If Mrs. Cavendish had killed Arthur to protect her claim to the Tresillian fortune, why would she leave the equipment in her own mill stream? It was too clumsy for a woman of her calculated intelligence. In St. Mary Mead, when a thing was too obvious, it was usually because someone had worked very hard to make it look that way. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the police station under the guise of delivering a jar of honey for Inspector Slack's recurring winter cold. While the inspector was momentarily distracted by a telephone call, she glanced at the items recovered from the stream, which were laid out on a trestle table. She didn't look at ledgers or microscopes. She looked at the tarpaulin. It was a heavy industrial-grade material, but caught in one of the brass eyelets was a tiny, vibrant thread of silk. It was a very specific shade of midnight blue, the exact colour of the evening cloak Lady Tresillian had been wearing on the terrace the previous day. "Most curious," she whispered, "a lady's silk in a gardener's oil." She realized then that the another twist wasn't just the discovery of the items, it was the realization that there were two people working toward the same end, but perhaps with very different methods. Lady Tressilian and Mrs. Cavendish were allies in blood, but were they allies in crime? The tarpaulin suggested a physical strength and a lack of refinement that didn't match Mrs. Cavendish's delicate hands, nor Lady Tressilian's fragile age. There was a third shadow in the garden. Miss Marple thought back to the professional grudge Miss Weatherby had mentioned, the row between Arthur and Lady Tressilian's head gardener, a silent, hulking man named Silas. Silas had been at Gull's Point for 30 years. He was more than a servant. He was a guardian of the estate's secrets, a man whose loyalty to Lady Tressilian was as rooted as the ancient oaks he tended. As she walked home, Miss Marple felt the chill of the truth. Arthur hadn't just discovered a secret. He had attempted to bargain with it. He had taken his ledgers and his proof to the one person he thought would pay to keep the Tressilian name pure, Lady Tressilian herself. But he had forgotten that some people do not pay with money. They pay with the silence of the earth. The true killer hadn't been the desperate daughter or the greedy nephew. He had been the status quo protector. But Miss Marple knew she needed more than a thread of silk to prove it. She needed to make the killer see that the secrets in the soil were still very much alive. The following evening the air turned sharply cold, a precursor to the first frost that Arthur Murchison had always predicted with such uncanny accuracy. Miss Marple, wrapped in her thickest woolen shawl and carrying a sturdy electric torch, made her way toward the Murchison greenhouses. She had leaked a very specific piece of information during her afternoon tea with Miss Weatherby, knowing it would reach the ears of everyone at Gull's Point within the hour. She had claimed that in her muddling way she had remembered Arthur mentioning a duplicate ledger, one buried not in a desk or a box but in the very soil of the Crimson Sovereign's original bedding, protected in a glass jar. The nursery was a place of long, distorted shadows under the moonlight. The glass houses gleamed like the rib cages of great prehistoric beasts. Miss Marple did not hide. She walked quite openly to the centre of the main greenhouse, her torch beam dancing over the rows of abandoned pots. She began to poke at the earth with a small gardening trowel, making a significant amount of noise for a woman of her usually quiet habits. "It's no use looking there, Miss Marple." Arthur was a many-layered man, but he wasn't a fool. The voice was low, resonant, and entirely devoid of the subservient tone usually adopted by village tradesmen. Silas, Lady Tressilian's head gardener, stepped out from behind a towering display of ferns. He was a man built of granite and old timber, his face a weathered map of 3 decades spent in the service of one family. In his hand he carried a heavy spade, and his boots were caked with the dark peaty mud of the Millhouse stream. "Good evening, Silas," Miss Marple said, straightening her back with a little wince of feigned effort. "I suppose you're right. My memory isn't what it was. I was so sure he said he'd buried the proof of the Tressilian irregularity right here. He was very proud of his biological evidence, you know. He thought it would protect him." Silas took a slow, deliberate step forward, the light of Miss Marple's torch catching the cold, flat grey of his eyes. "Proof is a heavy thing to carry, Miss Marple. It breaks people. Arthur thought he could use what he'd learned in France to squeeze Lady Tressilian. He thought he could demand a pension for life in exchange for not revealing that the Cavendish woman was Sir Richard's true heir. He didn't understand that some things are worth more than money. They're worth the peace of a lady who has given her life to this village." "And so you met him at the mill," Miss Marple said, her voice steady. "The oil on the path, the tarpaulin from the estate's shed. You didn't do it for yourself, did you, Silas? You did it because you couldn't bear to see Lady Tressilian's world pulled down by a man like Arthur Murchison." Silas's grip on the spade tightened. He was a common blackmailer. He'd forgotten his place. When I went to the mill to talk sense into him, he laughed. He showed me those ledgers, those slides. He said, "The Crimson Sovereign was his witness. I didn't plan it, but the rage just came up. I struck him down in the potting shed. When the Cavendish woman found us, she nearly fainted. She's a weak thing for all her fine clothes. She helped me wrap him in the tarpaulin because she knew if I fell, she fell with me. But you shredded the flowers, Miss Marple noted. That wasn't for the legacy, that was for you. A flicker of raw, professional hatred crossed Silas's face. 5 years. 5 years later he took that trophy with his sovereign. My roses, my lilies, they were better, but the judges only had eyes for his freakish hybrids. Destroying that flower was the only honest thing I did that night. It was a lie, just like the woman at the mill is a lie. And where is Arthur now, Silas? The police will find him eventually. The soil always gives up its dead. Silas gave a grim ghost of a smile. Not where I've put him. He's under the new foundation of the Tresillian summer house. 3 tons of concrete fell this morning. Not even Inspector Slack can dig through that without a warrant he'll never get. Miss Marple let her torch beam drop to Silas's feet. You've been very loyal, Silas. Loyalty is a rare quality. But you've made a mistake. You see, I never believed Arthur buried a second ledger. I just needed to know who would be desperate enough to come looking for it with a spade in the middle of the night. And I needed someone to admit that Mrs. Cavendish wasn't a stranger, but a co-conspirator. From the shadows at the far end of the greenhouse, a sudden bright light flared. Inspector Slack stepped forward, his face a mixture of triumph and profound shock. He had been standing near the ventilation controls, a notebook in his hand, having heard every word of the gardener's confession. Silas Thorne, Slack barked, his voice cracking the silence of the glasshouse. I'm arresting you for the murder of Arthur Murchison, and I think we'll be having a very long talk with Lady Tresillian and Mrs. Cavendish as well. Silas didn't move. He didn't try to run. He simply looked at Miss Marple with a weary kind of respect. You're a clever one, old lady. You look like a sparrow, but you've got the eyes of a hawk. It's not cleverness, Silas, Miss Marple said sadly as the constables moved in to take the spade from his hand. It's just that I've lived in St. Mary Mead for a very long time, and I've noticed that when people talk about protecting a legacy, they usually mean they're protecting a crime. It's a very common human failing, I'm afraid. As the police led Silas away, the village again fell into a heavy, expectant silence. The trap had been sprung, and the secret that had begun in a French botanical station had finally reached its grim conclusion in an English greenhouse. The following afternoon, the drawing room of the vicarage served as the stage for the final act of the tragedy, though the atmosphere was more akin to a sombre parish meeting than a dramatic unveiling. Inspector Slack stood by the fireplace, looking uncharacteristically subdued, while Griselda and the vicar sat in stunned silence. Miss Marple, her knitting needles once again clicking rhythmically, occupied her usual chair by the window. She had asked for this gathering not to gloat, but because she felt the village deserved to understand the why of the matter, for the how was merely a matter of mechanics. Miss Marple began by explaining that the mystery did not start with a missing gardener, but with a woman named Myra Cavendish, and a secret that had been dormant for 30 years. She spoke of Sir Richard Tresillian's long-forgotten summers in the south of France, a time the village had always dismissed as a mere artistic retreat. In reality, Sir Richard had fathered a child there, a girl he had supported discreetly until his death. Lady Tresillian had known of the girl's existence, but she had believed the secret was buried with her husband. When Myra Cavendish arrived in St. Mary Mead, she wasn't just a newcomer, she was a threat to the entire Tresillian estate, which was strictly entailed to legitimate heirs. It is a very old story, Miss Marple said gently, her eyes fixed on a delicate cable stitch. It reminds me so much of the case of the Cartwright family. Old Mr. Cartwright left his fortune to his niece, who turned out to be no niece at all. The family spent 10 years in the High Court, and in the end, the only people who gained anything were the solicitors. Lady Tresillian was determined to avoid such a scandal. She valued the family name above all else, above the truth, and ultimately, above a man's life. The room remained silent as she detailed how Arthur Murchison had inadvertently stumbled into the middle of this dynastic war. Arthur was not just a gardener, he was a man of immense scientific curiosity. He had been experimenting with the Crimson Sovereign for years, using seeds and techniques he had acquired through a correspondence with a botanical station in France, the very same station Sir Richard had frequented. When Arthur noticed that Myra Cavendish possessed a very rare hereditary trait, a specific type of colour blindness that Sir Richard had also possessed, he began to dig. He used his French connections to verify Myra's identity, and when he had the proof, he didn't go to the police. He went to Silas. Arthur thought Silas was his friend, Miss Marple continued, a note of sadness in her voice. He thought Silas, as a fellow gardener, would understand the brilliance of his biological proof. He showed Silas the ledgers and the slides, thinking they could use the information to ensure their own futures, but he failed to realize that Silas's loyalty wasn't to his profession, but to the Tresillian family. Silas saw Arthur not as a colleague, but as a blackmailer who was about to destroy the lady he had served for 30 years. The potting shed confrontation had been brief and violent. Silas had struck Arthur in a moment of protective rage, but the subsequent actions, the disposal of the equipment in the millstream and the shredding of the flowers, were calculated moves to frame Julian Murchison. Mrs. Cavendish, caught between her desire for the inheritance and her fear of the gallows, had helped Silas move the body. She had provided the heavy oil-stained tarpaulin and the use of the dark Daimler, leaving the mud and the silk thread that had eventually led Miss Marple to the truth. The shredded flowers were the most revealing part of all, Miss Marple noted, pausing her needles. Inspector Slack thought it was a sign of a criminal mind, but it was actually a sign of professional jealousy. Silas couldn't bear that Arthur's genius would be the thing that brought down the estate. By destroying the Crimson Sovereign, he was trying to erase the evidence and settle an old score at the same time. It was a very human reaction, albeit a very dark one. It's like poor Miss Higgins, who used to tear the recipes out of her neighbour's cookbooks so she'd be the only one who could make a proper sponge cake. Inspector Slack cleared his throat, looking slightly embarrassed. "And the body, Miss Marple? The summer house?" "Silas told me himself," she replied. "Under the concrete of the new foundation at Gull's Point. He thought that by burying Arthur there, he was making him a permanent part of the estate he had tried to threaten. A very grim sort of irony, I'm afraid, but the soil always tells its secrets eventually. One only needs to know where to look, and more importantly, one needs to understand the people who are doing the planting." As she finished her explanation, the vicar looked at her with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "It's a terrifying thought, Jane, that such darkness can exist behind a display of chrysanthemums." "The garden is a very competitive place, Vicar," Miss Marple said, returning to her knitting, "and human nature is the most complex organism. We all have our Crimson Sovereigns, the things we prize above all else, and we all have the capacity to protect them at any cost. We must simply pray that our costs are not as high as Silas Thorne's." The mystery was effectively over. The technicalities of the law would now take over, but for Miss Marple the resolution brought little joy. She knew the village would never look at the Tresillian estate or the annual flower show in the same way again. The truth had been revealed, but, as is often the case in St. Mary Mead, it had left a very bitter taste behind. The following Sunday, the bells of St. Mary Mead rang out with their usual persistent clarity, summoning the faithful and the curious alike to the morning service. To a stranger passing through, the village would have appeared the very picture of English tranquillity, the golden stone of the cottages glowing in the pale autumn light, and the fallen leaves of the horse chestnuts crunching underfoot. Yet, as the congregation filed out of the church, there was a noticeable shift in the social topography. The grand car from Gull's Point was absent, and the old mill house stood shuttered and silent, its gravel drive already beginning to sprout the first defiant weeds of neglect. Miss Marple sat on her accustomed bench in the churchyard, her hands folded over her prayer book. She was waiting for the crowd to disperse, preferring the quiet company of the ancient yew trees to the frantic whispers that were currently circulating near the lich gate. She watched as Mrs. Higgins held court, no doubt providing an embellished account of the police activity at the Tresillian summer house. The news that the concrete had indeed been broken up, revealing the remains of the unfortunate Arthur Murchison, had turned the village's fascination into a solemn, if somewhat ghoulish, awe. Griselda Clement soon joined her, looking weary but relieved that the immediate storm had passed. "The vicar says he's never seen the pews so full, Jane. I suppose everyone wanted to see if Lady Tresillian would show her face. The rumour is she's retired to the coast for her health, though we all know the police are still asking questions about how much she knew of Silas's activities. And as for Myra Cavendish, she vanished in the middle of the night before the warrant could even be served. I suppose she had practiced disappearing." Miss Marple sighed, a small, soft sound that was lost in the rustle of the wind. "It is a very sad business, Griselda, but then the pursuit of a legacy often is. It reminds me so much of the old Miller family from my youth. They spent 30 years fighting over a grandfather clock that didn't even keep proper time. In the end, they hated each other so much they couldn't remember why they wanted the clock in the first place. They only knew they didn't want anyone else to have it." "Do you think Silas will tell the whole truth at the trial?" Griselda asked, leaning against the cool stone of the bench. "I think Silas has his own truth," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "He believes he was a soldier protecting his queen. Men like that are very dangerous because they have a distorted sense of virtue. He didn't kill Arthur for money or for hate. He killed him for a misplaced sense of order. To him, the Tresillian name was a garden that had to be kept free of weeds at any cost. He simply forgot that once you start using a scythe so indiscriminately, you eventually destroy the very thing you were trying to protect." The two women sat in silence for a while, watching a robin hop across the weathered gravestones. The scandal had left a mark on St. Mary Mead that would take seasons to fade. The chrysanthemum show would likely be cancelled next year, and the crimson sovereign would remain a ghost in the village's horticultural history, a flower that had been too beautiful for its own good. "And what of Julian?" Griselda asked. "I hear he's actually taken a job at a nursery in Eastbourne. He says he wants to learn the trade properly without any shortcuts." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with a hint of genuine pleasure. "That is the one green shot in this entire sorry garden, dear. Sometimes a great shock is exactly what a young man needs to find his roots." Julian was a weed primarily because he had no purpose. Now that he has seen the price of his uncle's passion, perhaps he will find some of his own. It's like the winter frost. It looks quite deadly, but it often kills off the pests that would otherwise stifle the spring growth. As the sun climbed higher, Miss Marple rose from her seat. She felt the chill in the air more keenly than she used to, a reminder that the seasons were turning for her, just as they were for the village. She thought of Arthur Murchison, a man who had died because he couldn't help but seek the truth in the soil. He had been a difficult man, a proud man, and perhaps a greedy man. But he had been right about one thing: the secrets we plant always have a way of surfacing. She began the walk back to her cottage, her pace slow and deliberate. She would go home, make herself a nice cup of tea, and perhaps spend the afternoon working on the second mitten for the mission. The drama of Gull's Point and the old mill would soon become just another layer in the long, complicated history of St. Mary Mead. People would continue to gossip, garden, and guard their little secrets behind their lace curtains. "Human nature," she murmured to herself as she reached her garden gate. "It is very strange and confusing. We try so hard to prune it into shapes that please the neighbours, but the wildness is always there, just beneath the surface, waiting for a moment of heat to break through." She looked at her own flower beds, now being prepped for hibernation. There were no crimson sovereigns here, only the honest, reliable blooms of a quiet life. She was content. The mystery was solved, the balance was restored, and for an elderly lady in a lavender hat, that was quite enough. The world would always provide more puzzles, but for today, the sun was shining, the kettle would soon be boiling, and the garden was at peace.